We've seen the rest of the world be able to produce entrepreneurs and startup companies by a dozen. If we look at Silicon Valley, if we look at India, China, what are some of, over and above education, what are some of the inhibitors on the African continent to startups?
I think the primary inhibitor is always access to finance. I don't necessarily say there isn't sufficient finance, but I think that there is a mismatch between the finance that's available and the ideas that are seeking finance. And what we're beginning to see, certainly in Africa, not yet to a large extent in South Africa, is a growth of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. We see this to a high level in the US, particularly in areas like Silicon Valley, but also in other areas like Boulder, Colorado, and Austin, Texas, have profound entrepreneurial ecosystems. And these ecosystems bring together a host of things that an entrepreneur needs. Access to angel investors, also access to educational institutions that often provide some of the technology infrastructure that a startup business needs, and then also access to other startup businesses. Because increasingly, I think we see startup businesses supporting each other, and I think that's the beginning of an entrepreneurial ecosystem.
If I think back of some of the successful entrepreneurs who've had successful startups, the Googles, Twitters, and so on, big personalities, which begs the question, is entrepreneurship and startups an art or a science?
I think there's definitely an element of art that's brought to it, which you could maybe argue away as some of the soft skills, some of the personality, some of what drives you and motivates you as an entrepreneur, because you make choices if you're a highly educated person to forego corporate employment in favor of the uncertainty of entrepreneurship. And there's got to be something intrinsically that motivates you. But coupled with that there has to be some science, there has to be some technical skill, there has to be some business knowledge. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have an MBA, but you certainly have to be highly numerate and you have to understand how to negotiate. I think those are two very important aspects.
How important is failure as an imperative for startups?
We have a culture, firstly, I think, in South Africa that doesn't in any way reward failure. And I'm not suggesting that failure should be rewarded in the same way as success is rewarded. But I think we should recognize that failure is a mark on a journey of an entrepreneur. I think we also have a legal system that results in you often being heavily penalized. So if you fail as an entrepreneur and you're personally liable, obviously you'd end up becoming sequestrated. Which largely gives you the economic rights of a minor. And that makes it inordinately difficult to return. Whereas if we look at the US in particular, that mark of failure is often required. That many investors are not interested in looking at you until you've had one or two attempts and fails, because it shows a sense of commitment. It shows that you've remained committed.
Where else are we seeing lots of successes?
What's interesting to note is the number of incubators and accelerators that have grown. And I think that's a leading indicator of the interest in entrepreneurship. And often they're small and they're not heavily funded, but the fact that they exist, I think, is an important sign that there's a lot more interest in especially tech-driven entrepreneurship.
If we look at the technology landscape and tech startups that are coming up, almost reminiscent of the 2000 tech bust, are there some indicators that we're likely to fall in some of those pitfalls where people thought, if I've got a technology, I'm going to be the next big thing?
I think that there are some indicators that we might be heading towards another bubble, but I think at the same time the landscape has changed. So if we look at some of the tech businesses that launched and some that thrived and some that didn't, leading up to that burst of the bubble in 2000, they had a slightly different landscape. Technology was more expensive. Certainly there wasn't this focus on cloud technology. And I sense that it was still a sort of early stage of tech entrepreneurship. But if you look today, the young entrepreneur, the young 20-year-old working on an idea has access to technology today at virtually no cost that his or her counterpart 10 years ago simply didn't have access to.
But does that not mean that there's low barriers to entry for everybody?
Yeah, there is. And I think the challenge then becomes, who do you invest in? So I think that's given rise to, for instance, crowdfunding as a potential model, because I'm not sure that too many venture capitalists or even angel funders will touch some of those tech businesses, because really their technology is simply it's not intellectual property. It's a great idea, but there's something that you simply can't protect. But I do sense that the ability to get going, the ability to get started is substantially easier today than it was 10 years ago. So yes, it creates a lower barrier to entry, but it also promotes entrepreneurship with young people, especially those that are passionate about becoming entrepreneurs.
So the playing fields have been leveled. It's really about picking the stars.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe some of that process for an investor is to allow, those that are going to survive to rise to the surface and those that aren't to drop to the bottom, and to make sort of later stage investment, which I think, again, reinforces this point that some initial seed funding or angel funding is needed. You've got to be able to pick some of those winners early on. And clearly some businesses do this well. If you look at Y Combinator in the US, who two of their emblematic picks were Dropbox and Airbnb. And when asked, did they know that these were going to be big hits, they were honest enough to say we had no idea.
If we look at the ecosystem and some of the stakeholders, government, business, what can be done to ensure that we create successful startups?
I think the first is to make a little bit more available funding at the early stage, at that sort of seed stage. It's often at a point at which an entrepreneur needs 6 to 12 months of runway just to prove a concept, and really needs to be kept alive with a little bit of income and a little bit of capital to keep the business going. I'd like to see a little bit more investment occur at that end. And I think that government should be focused there, because really government should be looking at this as a high-risk investor. To pass that risk onto the market, I don't think makes sense. I think the space is important, physical space, and we're starting to see that more and more with incubators. I'd certainly love to see free Wi-Fi for all entrepreneurs. Just make this simple and easy. We've got to change some of the legislation around how easy it is or how costly it is to start a business, to register a business, because otherwise those businesses operate largely outside of the formal tax net. So we've got to bring those businesses in and make them a little bit easier. I'd like to see definitely more focus on allowing entrepreneurs to immigrate, to come to South Africa and work here. So there are immigrant entrepreneurship visas, entrepreneur visas that we see that other countries have. I think there are great skills in the rest of Africa that we're just simply not harnessing.
Internationally, we've seen academic institutions and research houses play quite a driving role in creating entrepreneurs. Do we have room for that locally?
I think we do. And I think we're starting to see it, especially with business schools in South Africa, beginning to play the role and, in fact, beginning to stretch their role into the incubation and acceleration space. I don't think we've seen that to the point of them beginning to fund businesses as we see as some of the Ivy League institutions in America like Harvard and Stanford, which actually invest in their own student businesses. But I think that universities are beginning to play that role increasingly. And I think that they are the honest broker. They are the individual that can help, or the institution that can help to bring this ecosystem together.